Such was the impression made upon me by the Brown family when I first saw them all together in Cranford Church. The captain I had met before, on the occasion of the smoky chimney, which he had cured by some simple alteration in the flue. In church, he held his double eyeglass to his eyes during the morning hymn, and then lifted up his head erect and sang out loud and joyfully. He made the responses louder than the clerk, an old man with a piping, feeble voice, who, I think, felt aggrieved at the captain's sonorous bass, and quivered higher and higher in consequence. On coming out of church, the brisk captain paid the most gallant attention to his two daughters. He nodded and smiled to his acquaintances, but he shook hands with none until he had helped Miss Brown to unfurl her umbrella, had relieved her of her prayer book, and had waited patiently till she, with trembling nervous hands, had taken up her gown to walk through the wet roads. I wonder what the Cranford ladies did with Captain Brown at their parties. We had often rejoiced in former days that there was no gentleman to be attended to, and to find conversation for at the card parties. We had congratulated ourselves upon the snugness of the evenings, and in our love for gentility and distaste of mankind, we had almost persuaded ourselves that to be a man was to be vulgar, so that when I found my friends and hostess, Miss Jenkins, was going to have a party in my honor, and the captain and the Miss Browns were invited, I wondered much what would be the course of the evening. Card tables with green baize tops were set out by daylight, just as usual. It was the third week in November, so the evenings closed in about 4. Candles and clean packs of cards were arranged on each table. The fire was made up. The neat maidservant had received her last directions, and there we stood, dressed in our best, each with a candle lighter in our hands, ready to dart at the candles as soon as the first knock came. Parties in Cranford were solemn festivities, making the ladies feel gravely elated as they sat together in their best dresses. As soon as 3 had arrived, we sat down to preference, I being the unlucky 4th. The next 4 comers were put down immediately to another table, and presently the tea trays, which I had seen set out in the storeroom as I had passed in the morning, were placed each on the middle of a card table. The china was delicate eggshell. The old-fashioned silver glittered with polishing, but the eatables were of the slightest description. While the trays were yet on the tables, Captain and the Miss Browns came in, and I could see that somehow or other the captain was a favorite with all the ladies present. Ruffled brows were smooth, sharp voices lowered at his approach. Miss Brown looked ill and depressed almost to gloom. Miss Jessie smiled as usual, and seemed nearly as popular as her father. He immediately and quietly assumed the man's place in the room, attended to everyone's wants, lessened the pretty maidservant's labor by waiting on empty cups and bread and butterless ladies, and yet did it all in so easy and dignified a manner, and so much as if it were a matter of course for the strong to attend to the weak, that he was a true man throughout. He played for 3-penny points, with as grave an interest as if they had been pounds, and yet in all his attention to strangers he had an eye on his suffering daughter. For suffering I was sure she was, though to many eyes she might only appear to be irritable. Miss Jessie could not play cards, but she talked to the sitters out, who, before her coming, had been rather inclined to be cross. She sang, too, to an old cracked piano, which I think had been a spinet in its youth. Miss Jessie sang Jock of Hazeldean a little out of tune, but we were none of us musical, though Miss Jenkins beat time out of time by way of appearing to be so. It was very good of Miss Jenkins to do this, for I had seen that a little before she had been a good deal annoyed by Miss Jessie Brown's unguarded admission that she had an uncle, her mother's brother, who was a shopkeeper in Edinburgh. Miss Jenkins tried to drown this confession by a terrible cough, for the Honorable Miss Jameson was sitting at a card table nearest Miss Jessie, and what would she say or think if she found out she was in the same room with the shopkeeper's niece? But Miss Jessie Brown, who had no tact, as we all agreed the next morning, would repeat the information, and assure Miss Pole she could easily get her the identical Shetland wool required, through my uncle, who has the best assortment of Shetland goods of any one in Edinburgh. it was to take the taste of this out of our mouths and the sound of this out of our ears that Miss Jenkins proposed music. So I say again, it was very good of her to beat time to the song. When the trays reappeared, the biscuits and wine, punctually at 8:45, there were conversation, comparing of cards, and talking over tricks. But by and by Captain Brown sported a bit of literature. "Have you seen any numbers of the Pickwick papers?" said he. They were then publishing in parts. Capital thing! Now Miss Jenkins was daughter of a deceased rector of Cranford, and on the strength of a number of manuscript sermons and a pretty good library of divinity, considered herself literary, and she looked upon any conversation about books as a challenge to her. So she answered and said, yes, she had seen them. Indeed, she might say she had read them. "And what do you think of them?" exclaimed Captain Brown. "Aren't they famously good?" So urged, Miss Jenkins could not but speak. "I must say, I don't think they are by any means equal to Dr. Johnson. Still, perhaps, the author is young. Let him persevere, and who knows what he may become if he will take the great doctor for his model." This was evidently too much for Captain Brown to take placidly, and I saw the words on the tip of his tongue before Miss Jenkins had finished her sentence. "It is quite a different sort of thing, my dear madam," he began. "I am quite aware of that," returned she, "and I make allowances, Captain Brown." "Just allow me to read you a scene out of this month's number," pleaded he. "I had it only this morning, and I don't think the company can have read it yet." "As you please," said she, settling herself with an air of resignation. He read the account of the swarry, which Sam Weller gave at Bath. Some of us laughed heartily. I did not dare, because I was staying in the house. Miss Jenkins sat in patient gravity. When it was ended, she turned to me and said with mild dignity, "Fetch me Rosales, my dear, out of the book-room." When I had brought it to her, she turned to Captain Brown. "Now allow me to read you a scene, and then the present company can judge between your favorite Mr. Boz and Dr. Johnson." She read one of the conversations between Rosales and Imlach in a high-pitched, majestic voice, and when she had ended, she said, "I imagine I am now justified in my preference of Dr. Johnson as a writer of fiction." The captain screwed his lips up and drummed on the table, but he did not speak. She thought she would give him a finishing blow or two. "I consider it vulgar and below the dignity of literature to publish in numbers." "How was that Rambler published, ma'am?" asked Captain Brown in a low voice, which I think Miss Jenkins could not have heard. "Dr. Johnson's style is a model for young beginners. My father recommended it to me when I began to write letters. I have formed my own style upon it. I recommended it to your favorite." "I should be very sorry for him to exchange his style for any such pompous writing," said Captain Brown. Miss Jenkins felt this a personal affront in a way of which the captain had not dreamed. Epistolary writing she and her friends considered as her forte. Many a copy of many a letter have I seen written and corrected on the slate before she seized the half hour just previous to post time to assure her friends of this or of that, and Dr. Johnson was, as she said, her model in these compositions. She drew herself up with dignity, and only replied to Captain Brown's last remark by saying, with marked emphasis on every syllable, "I prefer Dr. Johnson to Mr. Boz." It is said, I won't vouch for the fact, that Captain Brown was heard to say, sotto voce, "Didn't Dr. Johnson?" If he did, he was penitent afterwards, as he showed by going to stand near Miss Jenkins' armchair and endeavoring to beguile her into conversation on some more pleasing subject, but she was inexorable. The next day she made the remark I have mentioned about Miss Jessie's dimples. Chapter 2. The Captain. It was impossible to live a month at Cranford and not know the daily habits of each resident, and long before my visit was ended, I knew much concerning the whole Brown trio. There was nothing new to be discovered respecting their poverty, for they had spoken simply and openly about that from the very first. They made no mystery of the necessity for their being economical. All that remained to be discovered was the captain's infinite kindness of heart and the various modes in which, unconsciously to himself, he manifested it. Some little anecdotes were talked about for some time after they occurred. As we did not read much, and as all the ladies were pretty well suited with servants, there was a dearth of subjects for conversation. We therefore discussed the circumstances of the captain taking a poor old woman's dinner out of her hand one very slippery Sunday. He had met her returning from the bakehouse as he came from church, and noticed her precarious footing, and, with the grave dignity with which he did everything, he relieved her of her burden, and steered along the street by her side, carrying her baked mutton and potatoes safely home. This was thought very eccentric, and it was rather expected that he would pay a round of calls on the Monday morning to explain and apologize to the Cranford sense of propriety. But he did no such thing, and then it was decided that he was ashamed and was keeping out of sight. In a kindly pity for him, we began to say, after all, the Sunday morning's occurrence showed great goodness of heart, and it was resolved that he should be comforted on his next appearance among us. But lo, he came down upon us, untouched by any sense of shame, speaking loud and bass as ever, his head thrown back, his wig as jaunty and well curled as usual, and we were obliged to conclude he had forgotten all about Sunday. Miss Pole and Miss Jessie Brown had set up a kind of intimacy on the strength of the Shetland wool and the new knitting stitches. So it happened that when I went to visit Miss Pole, I saw more of the Browns than I had done while staying with Miss Jenkins, who had never got over what she called Captain Brown's disparaging remarks upon Dr. Johnson as a writer of light and agreeable fiction. I found that Miss Brown was seriously ill of some lingering, incurable complaint, the pain occasioned by which gave the uneasy expression to her face that I had taken for unmitigated crossness. Cross, too, she was at times, when the nervous irritability occasioned by her disease became past endurance. Miss Jessie bore with her at these times even more patiently than she did with the bitter self-upbraidings by which they were invariably succeeded. Miss Brown used to accuse herself, not merely of hasty and irritable temper, but also of being the cause why her father and sisters were obliged to pinch in order to allow her the small luxuries which were necessary in her condition. She would so fain have made sacrifices for them and have lightened their cares that the original generosity of her disposition added acerbity to her temper. All this was borne by Miss Jessie and her father with more than placidity, with absolute tenderness. I forgave Miss Jessie her singing out of tune and her juvenility of dress when I saw her at home. I came to perceive that Captain Brown's dark Brutus wig and padded coats, alas, too often threadbare, were remnants of the military smartness of his youth, which he now wore unconsciously. He was a man of infinite resources gained in his barrack experience. As he confessed, no one could black his boots to please him except himself. But indeed, he was not above saving the little maidservant's labors in every way, knowing most likely that his daughter's illness made the place a hard one. He endeavored to make peace with Miss Jenkins soon after the memorable dispute I have named, by a present of a wooden fire shovel, his own making, having heard her say how much the grating of an iron one annoyed her. She received the present with cool gratitude and thanked him formally. When he was gone, she bade me put it away in the lumber room, feeling probably that no present from a man who preferred Mr. Boz to Dr. Johnson could be less jarring than an iron fire shovel. Such was the state of things when I left Cranford and went to Drumble. I had, however, several correspondents who kept me au fait as to the proceedings of their dear little town. There was Miss Pole, who was becoming as much absorbed in crochet as she had been once in knitting, and the burden of whose letter was something like, "But don't you forget the white worsted at Flint's," of the old song, for at the end of every sentence of news came a fresh direction as to some crochet commission which I was to execute for her. Miss Matilda Jenkins, who did not mind being called Miss Mattie when Miss Jenkins was not by, wrote nice, kind, rambling letters, now and then venturing into an opinion of her own, but suddenly pulling herself up, and either begging me not to name what she had said, as Deborah thought differently, and she knew, or else putting into a postscript to the effect that Since writing the above, she had been talking